But nuclear energy is a totally viable alternative to other forms of fossil
Then why
fuels.
does the radical left oppose it?
If you want to construct an actual pro-nuclear argument, this is what you do.
I don't think you can compare like Hitler to people that are worried about climate change. The worry that I have here is...
Why not?
If Jordan actually cared about helping the poor or providing cheap power, he'd be in favor of renewables.
that pain and suffering is going to be short-term and far less than the long-term pain and suffering.
The
Taxes on like...
outcome will be mass starvation.
I'm
in
getting
this
to it. Okay.
situation.
Yeah, I'm getting to it. Okay. Pollution would be a good example of that. And rather than saying like, well, no company can pollute this much, or, you know, if you're a company, you have to use these things because the other things are making too much pollution. All you do is you say, okay, well, if we've determined that, say, carbon is bad for the atmosphere, well, we're just going to attach a little price to that. The government is going to say that, yeah, if you pollute this much, here's the price. And then if you want to pay for it, you can. But that type of intervention in the economy basically allows the free market to hopefully do its job because the government has tacked on a little bit of a price something that tries to account for the cost of that externality. Yeah.
Great. That's a great example. We can go right down that rabbit hole. Carbon. I wondered what would happen when the left, the progressives, ran into a conundrum. And the conundrum is quite straightforward. If you pursue carbon pricing and you make energy more expensive, then you hurt the poor. And I don't think you just hurt them. In fact, I know you just don't hurt them. I heard a man 2 days ago who's fed 350 million people in the course of his life, heading the UN's largest relief agency, make the claim quite straightforwardly that misappropriation on the part of interventionist governments increased the rate of absolute privation dramatically in the world over the last 4 or 5 years. And that has happened not least because of carbon pricing, not just carbon pricing, but the insistence that carbon per se is an externality that we should control. Now, Germany's paid a radical price for that, for example. So their power is now about 5 times as expensive as it could be. And they pollute more per unit of power than they did 10 years ago before they introduced these policies that were hypothetically there to account for externality.
German energy comes up a number of times in this discussion, so we'll address it now. German wholesale energy prices are in line with other European countries, even nuclear-heavy France. Wholesale price is what the energy costs for the grid. Where it diverges from France is on retail price. This is where a host of taxes and regulations and other things affect the prices. As you can see in this chart, before the 2022 spike, over 50% of German retail costs were neither grid nor energy costs. Note, Germany has removed the renewable fee. Germany is around 50% renewables. Germany, along with everyone in the EU, felt the 2022 natural gas price shocks. The countries that fared the best had the least reliance on fossil fuels. In fact, Spain put a price cap on their natural gas in 2022. They have over 50% renewables and among the lowest energy prices in Europe. If anything, this is just an argument for big government and regulation. Germany would probably have cheaper prices had they kept their nuclear plants online, but regardless, Jordan is just completely wrong on this point. And finally, German CO2 per capita has been going down dramatically over the last couple of decades. Again, I don't know what he's talking about. Basically, everything Jordan says about Germany is totally wrong.
And the externality was carbon dioxide. I don't think that's a computable externality. And I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that it's actually an externality that we should be warping the economic system to ameliorate if the cost of that, and it will be an increase in absolute privation among the world's poor. So, and here's an additional argument on that front with regards to externalities. You get that wrong, and here's something you could get right instead. If you ameliorate absolute poverty among the world's 1 billion poorest, they take a longer view of the future. And that means they become environmentally aware. And so the fastest route to a sustainable planet could well be the remediation of absolute poverty. And the best route to that is cheap energy. And we're interfering with the development of cheap energy by meddling with the hypothetically detrimental externality of carbon dioxide. And so I think this is a complete bloody travesty, by the way. We are putting the lives of hundreds of millions of people directly at risk right now to hypothetically save people in the future, depending on the accuracy of our projections 100 years out. And these interventionists, these people who are remediating externalities, they actually believe that they can calculate an economic projection 1 century out. That's utterly delusional.
So just to be clear, the first thing, I was just giving an example of how you can use like a government intervention to make a free market track something, which is what cap and trade or like carbon taxes would do. I wasn't necessarily speaking to the strength of that individual thing, but
that's a good thing to focus on.
Yeah, we can focus on that as well.
Major externality.
Yeah, we can focus on that as well. So the first thing, this is going to sound mean, but I'm very realistic. There needs to be a better argument than just it disproportionately impacts the poor. That's not always
classic leftist argument.
Sure, it might be, but
as you've seen throughout this video, I've been debunking Jordan's claims, but let's dive a little bit deeper into the poor. Jordan seems to care an awful lot about the poor, but doesn't seem to understand that renewables are now cheaper than most fossil fuel systems, although this is a recent outcome. He says that the carbon tax will cause poverty among the poor, but that doesn't really align with the literature, and as far as we can see, carbon taxes don't have an impact on GDP. And if they do, it's slightly positive. Here in Canada, the way the carbon tax works is that the government collects these taxes and gives it back to Canadians on a per capita basis. Since poor people generally consume less CO2, poorer people actually get back more than they spend on carbon taxes here. Jordan makes a claim that we can't model the future, but we can estimate historical outcomes. Or does he think that natural scientists and economists are just too incompetent for that too? Nevertheless, we already know that the global south has lost out on economic prosperity due to climate change. I think it's fair to assume that increasing temperatures would exacerbate that problem. Want to help the poor? Then minimize CO2 and provide them with the cheapest energy sources on the planet like solar and wind. Later in the video, I'll delve deeper into how intermittency and problems with renewables can be resolved.
But it's the same argument you made to justify your swing to the left at the beginning of our discussion. You said that you were looking at economic inequalities that disproportionately affected the poor. So I can't see why, and I'm not trying to be mean about this either. I can't see why you could base your argument that it was morally appropriate for you to swing to the left from your previous position because you saw disproportionate effects on the poor, and I can't use that argument in the situation that I'm presenting it right now.
Well, because it depends on if we think it's a condition that ought to be remedied or not.
My argument was that the fastest way out of absolute privation for the world's bottom billion people is through cheap energy.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there. So just working my way towards that. I just want to say that just because something targets the poor is not necessarily an argument against it.
Depends on how hard it targets them, and it depends on whether mass starvation is the outcome.
The outcome is important. That I agree with. So, for instance, like a sin tax.
The outcome will be mass starvation.
I'm getting to it. Okay. Yeah, I'm getting to it. Okay. Sin taxes on like cigarettes and alcohol are always going to disproportionately impact the poor, or even sugar, we might say, right? But just because that disproportionately impacts the poor, is that a good thing or a bad thing? These are probably the people that suffer the most from those particular afflictions. If you believe climate models, or if you believe that we're heading in a certain direction in terms of climate, the overall warming of the planet, would be the same argument you would make for climate change.
Only if you believe that you could model economic development 100 years into the future.
Well, we're not trying to model, we're more concerned with modeling climate development, economic development.
We're
yes,
equally, tell me how I'm wrong. I don't believe that, because what I see happening is two things. We have climate models that purport to explain what's going to happen over a century on the climate side, but we have economic models layered right on top of those that claim that there's going to be various forms of disaster for human beings economically as a consequence of that climate change. And so that's like two towers of Babel stacked on top of one another. And so, because if people were just saying, oh, the climate's going to change, there'd be no moral impetus in that. It's the climate's going to change, and that's going to be disastrous for the biosphere and for humanity. But that's an economic argument as well as a climate-based argument.
It's both, but the worst projections of what would happen if the climate took a disastrous turn are worse than the worst projections of what is our planet going to look like economically if we hardcore police, fossil.
But why would you? Okay, but I don't understand the distinction between the models.
Well, the argument would be that whatever pain and suffering poor people might endure right now because of a move towards green energy, that pain and suffering is going to be short-term and far less than the long-term pain and suffering.
Right, but that's dependent on the integrity of the economic models and
the climate models as well, right?
Economic and climate modeling is a huge subject. I've heard this nonsense about climate models are inaccurate from many climate change detractors. It's just not true. As you can see with these charts, we're pretty good at modeling global temperature. In regards to the economic models, many economists believe that the carbon tax is the most effective method to deal with climate change. And Jordan is right that economic modeling is important to gauge how much we should care about it. Jordan needs to provide more evidence than modeling is hard, economists stupid, to justify why economic projections are wrong. This also says nothing about looking back in history to show how much economic systems have been impacted by climate change. William Nordhaus, who Ben Shapiro often quotes, has been modeling economic and climate damage since the 1980s, and is generally on the low end of climate damage modeling. In his first paper, he assumed that since 90% of jobs were indoors, that only 10% of the GDP would be affected by climate change, something I would argue is probably an underestimation. This resulted in him suggesting a modest carbon tax of around $20 per ton. Recent updates to his modeling is suggesting around $60 a ton, because we haven't done fuck all since then. You include meta-analyses on different climate models that make probably better assumptions than Nordhaus made, you get a pretty big range. So even if the modeling isn't perfect, we know that historical damage exists. We can project the historical damage to a range of possibilities and put some semblance of a carbon tax on it. That looks like anywhere from $60 to $150 per ton in 2025. Most economic models in this field usually mention that they're underestimating certain things because they're difficult to capture. A conservative approach would then be to err on the side of caution and implement higher carbon taxes, not lower ones. As a side note, the economic cutoff for carbon capture and storage is around $70 per ton for 90% capture. But most of this is moot since renewable systems are already cheaper than fossil fuels. The tax just makes them less economic. Based on Jordan's claims, you'll see me jokingly do some economic modeling in a second here.
Exactly, but is in exactly the stacked manner that I described. And like, there's nobody in 1890 who could have predicted what was going to happen in 1990 economically. Not a bit. Not a bit. And if we think we can predict like 50 years out now with the current rate of technology and calculate the potential impact of climate change on economic flourishing for human beings, we're deluded. No one can do that. And then, it's worse. So imagine that as you do that and you project outward, your margin of error increases. That's absolutely, definitely the case. And at some point, certainly on the climate side, the margin of error gets rapidly to the point where it subsumes any estimate of the degree to which the climate is going to transform. And that happens even more rapidly on the economic side.
Potentially, but right now, I think this is a disagreement on the fact of the matter, though, not the philosophy of what we're talking about in terms of controlling externalities. If we think, I'm curious, let's say that we think we can accurately predict the climate and the economic impact, and we think that the climate impact would be far worse if we don't account for that, both in terms of human conditions.
I don't believe any of those presumptions.
But then if you don't, but I mean, like, obviously, if I agreed with that factual analysis, I would probably agree with you on the prescription here too, right? If I thought that like none of the climate models were accurate or couldn't accurately predict anything, then I'd also say why make?
Well, they're not sufficiently accurate. That's the first thing. And because they have a margin of error, and it's a large margin of error, they don't even model cloud coverage well. That's a big problem. They don't have the resolution. They don't have nearly the resolution to produce the accuracy that's claimed by the climate apocalypse mongers.
People keep saying that, but we just got another one of the hottest years on record. How many times are we going to have another hottest year on record? How many times are we going to have an increase of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere before we're finally like, okay.
I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because it depends. The scientific answer to that question depends precisely on the time frame over which you evaluate the climate fluctuation. And that's actually an intractable scientific problem. So you might say, well, if you take the last 100 years, this variation looks pretty dismal. And I'd say, well, what if you took the last 150,000 years? Or the last 10,000 or the last 10 million? You can't specify the damn time frame of analysis.
The time frame is incredibly important. That would be like saying, look at your, let's say somebody developed cancer and they didn't realize it, and the person has lost, 40 or 50 pounds in the past 6 months. And I'm just like, you look very sickly. And you're like, okay, well, look at my weight fluctuation over the past 10 years. You say, well, that doesn't really matter. What matters is the fact that
I'm not saying the time frame isn't important.
Well, but I'm saying
that it is important.
Yeah,
I'm saying I don't know how to specify it.
Well, you would probably specify it with the beginning of the industrial age, right?
Why?
Because that's when carbon dioxide, which is a gas that's seen as trapping more heat on the planet.
Why is that relevant to the time over which you compute the variability?
Because it seems like as carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere, the surface temperatures have risen at a rate that is a departure from what we'd expect over 150,000 year cycles of temperature variations on the planet.
No, not with that time frame. That's just not the case.
It's absolutely the case.
No, what do you mean? You just flipped to 150,000 year time span.
What I'm saying is that if we expect to see a temperature do this in a 150,000 year time span, in a 100 year time span, seeing it do this, that's very worrying. Now,
you mean like Michael Mann's hockey stick, the one that's under attack right now in court by a major statistician who claimed that he falsified his data? I mean, that spike?
I'm talking about the record temperatures that have been declared for like the past 5 years that have also increased with the concentration of parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that every model is perfect.
They're
but
not
right now,
perfect.
sure, but right now we're like standing in traffic with our eyes closed saying the car hasn't hit me yet, so I don't think there's any coming. I think it's pretty undeniable at this point that there is an impact on climate across the planet. I just
I
don't
think
know.
that's highly deniable. We have no idea what the impact is from. We don't know where the carbon dioxide is from. We can't measure the warming of the oceans. We have terrible temperature records going back 100 years. Almost all the terrestrial temperature detection sites were first put outside urban areas, and then as
And then
you're
cities,
right, and then
they
you
measure
have to
warming.
correct. Then you have to correct for the movement of the urban areas, and then you introduce an error parameter that's larger than the purported increase in temperature that you're planning to measure. This isn't data. This is guess.
Okay, data correction. Please end my suffering. This is once again a huge topic. The issue with Jordan here is that there's a grain of truth in what he's saying. A lot of climate science requires us to interpret data from our sensors. And when we look at data over long periods of time, we need some way to make sure that data is normalized to each other. The two most famous examples are ocean buoys, which measured temperature on shipping lanes, but had to be corrected downwards because the ships themselves added heat. Then there was a satellite that measured surface temperature and had to be corrected because its temperature calculations didn't include its increased orbit. Thus, it underpredicted climate change. This comes down to a question of accuracy versus precision. We correct historical data to normalize accuracy across multiple types of technology. If you've ever worked in a processing plant like pulp and paper, oil and gas, or mining, you'd be familiar with this phenomenon, where a sensor might be out of calibration, but you can still use it for trends. In the case of climate change, the trends always go up. But like seriously, this is one of the easiest experiments you could ever do. You could literally look at your mercury thermometer every day since 1980 and measure it, and then you'd get an upward trend. Then you do that across the globe with a bunch of people, and you would get an aggregate global temperature. Why would Jordan die on this hill? Also, our models are broadly correct, so whatever, fuck me. I've listened to Jordan say this so many times editing this video, I can feel my brain cells dying.
And there's something weird underneath it. There's something weird that isn't oriented well towards human beings underneath it. It has this guise of compassion. Oh, we're going to save the poor in the future. It's like that's what the bloody communists said. And they killed a lot of people doing it. And we're walking down that same road now with this insistence that, you know, we're so compassionate that we care about the poor 100 years from now. And if we have to wipe out several 100 million of them now, well, that's a small price to pay for the future utopia. And we've heard that sort of thing before. And the alternative to that is to stop having global level elites plot out a utopian future or even an anti-dystopian future. And that's exactly what's happening now with organizations like the WEF. And if this wasn't immediately impacting the poor in a devastating manner, I wouldn't care about it that much, but it is. You know, I watched over the course of the last 5 years, the estimates of the number of people who were in serious danger of food privation rise from about 100 million to about 350 million. That's a major price to pay.
Food insecurity is actually the video that I was originally working on, but then this podcast dropped. So this is the gist. We're able to estimate the negative consequences of historic climate change on crop production. We also know that many plants have maximum heat thresholds before they yield less. Droughts and floods cause real economic damage that we can measure to crops which disproportionately affect the poor. We can estimate about a 3% calorie loss leading to a 20% increase in food prices. The data clearly shows that we're producing less food today than we otherwise would be had climate change not happened. And yes, it includes the increased biomass from CO2 being a plant food. Heat stress outweighs these gains significantly. Overall, the actual data on this topic should lead Jordan to the opposite conclusion he's making. Motivated reasoning is a bitch.
For progress on the climate front that's so narrow it can't even be measured.
I don't think the increase in hungry people on the planet is because of climate policies.
Why not?
Because I don't think that countries in Africa are being pushed away from fossil fuels. I think most developing
Of course they
nations
are. They can't even get loans from the World Bank to pursue fossil fuel development. And there's plenty of African leaders who are screeching at the top of their lungs about that. They're going to have to turn to renewables. Yeah, well, good luck with that, because renewables have no energy density. Besides that, they're not renewable and they're not environmentally friendly. And then one more thing. There's one more weird thing underneath all of this.
Okay.
Renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. As I've shown in my older videos, renewables have some of the best dollar per megawatts of any energy system at low CO2 emissions. Yes, they're intermittent. That's why the solution to renewables is multifaceted. There's tons of studies on this topic. I've added a card to my old videos. But the short answer is long line transmission and battery storage. Even when these costs are accounted for, these overall reduce the total cost of renewable energy so that you can meet 24/7 demand. Yes, those costs are below fossil fuels. This isn't some brand new idea. The EU does it. BC already sends 25% of its power to the US. Transmission lines are the key to cheap 24/7 renewable power because it dampens local energy droughts. It's called a copper plate. But in the meantime, as we decarbonize, we can use natural gas in its role as a peaker plant, meaning the answer is to always build more renewables and decommission gas plants as they're unnecessary. That's why Biden's infrastructure bill is so awesome. It addresses this issue head on. If Jordan actually cared about helping the poor or providing cheap power, he'd be in favor of renewables.
Well, let's say if carbon dioxide was actually your bugbear and it was genuine. Well, then why wouldn't the Greens, for example, in Africa, the progressives, be agitating to expand the use of nuclear energy? Especially because Germany has to import it anyways, especially because France has demonstrated that it's possible. We could drive down the cost of energy with low-cost nuclear, and there'd be no carbon production. And then the poor people would have something to eat because they'd have enough energy. And that isn't what's happening. And that's one of the things that makes me extremely skeptical of the entire narrative. It's like two things. The left will sacrifice the poor to save the planet. And the left will deindustrialize even at the nuclear level, despite the fact that it devastates the poor. And that's even worse because if you devastate the poor and you force them into a short-term orientation, in any given country where starvation beckons, for example, they will cut down all the trees and they will kill down all the animals and they will destroy the ecosphere. Well, boys and girls, doesn't look like it's working. All you've managed to do is make energy 5 times as expensive and more polluting. You were wrong. That didn't work. And I can't understand. You can help me. That's why you're here today talking to me. I can't understand how the left can support this.
Fuck me. Round trip, renewables create less CO2 than conventional fossil fuels, and it's not even close. Even when you take into account carbon capture, which reduces energy output of those plants anyway, making them even less competitive, there's surely a problem with waste, turbine blades being the worst. But there's no way that you can say that creating terrestrial waste is worse than climate change. And then additionally, the rest of the turbine, most batteries, solar panels can all be recycled. The reason that they're not yet is due to the economies of scale. Once we have sufficient waste stockpiles to merit recycling, it's going to be a huge industry. Also, engineering firms are currently working on the turbine blade problem. In terms of mineral demand, solar and wind are made of relatively common materials, most of which can be mined right here in Canada. Batteries are another story, and I'll have a video about that soon, but there are battery chemistries that get us away from cobalt and lithium. Even still, these are 2 metals that are found in Canada and the United States. Renewables aren't no harm, it's just a shit ton less. And you can't act like it's even remotely equivalent. We're talking about orders of magnitude less harm.
I just don't understand what's happening in Germany or in the UK. Like, it's insane. Like, look, man, if they would have got rid of the nuclear plants and made energy 5 times as expensive, and the consequence would have been they weren't burning lignite coal as a backup, and their unit production of energy, of pollution per unit of energy had plummeted, you could say, well, look, we hurt a lot of poor people, but at least the air is cleaner. It's like, no, air's worse and everyone's poorer. So explain to me how the hell the left can be anti-nuclear.
Okay.
I don't understand it at all.
Gotcha. All right.
I wouldn't call an average a very sophisticated model analogous to a climate change.
That's the difference between climate and weather, though, right? Is that climate isn't going to tell you what the temperature is on a given day, but it might tell you the average surface temperature over a period of 1 year or 10 years. And then that's the difference between climate and weather. That's the difference between the market and stuff.
Difference.
It is a hypothetical, but again, we're seeing more and more and more data every single year that things are getting hotter and hotter.
Let's jump out of our cloud of presuppositions for a minute.
Sure.
Now, one of the things that...
No, wait. Before we do that, actually, because I don't want to say, there are some things that we've gotten as a result of investing in green energy that have been good. So, for instance, the power of solar energy has dropped dramatically in the United States, faster than anybody thought possible, such that solar energy is like competitive or beating fossil fuels in certain areas. As long as you can set the solar panels up, you're literally beating fossil fuels.
Yeah, and as long as the sun is shining.
Well, it still is. We're not in nuclear winter yet.
No, but it isn't when it's cloudy. And
that's why I said depending on where you live. There are places, equatorial places, if you're trying to set up a solar panel in Seattle, you might not have as much luck, or New York City might not have as much. Or in Germany, true.
Or Europe, or in Canada.
There are also...
Jordan is either lying or ignorant. Even when you account for low capacity factors, factors like we have in Alberta, down at 20%, solar is still economic. Here's a simple calculation showing how much land area Alberta and Canada would need to power the whole country on shitty solar. Then when you throw solar, wind, hydroelectric power, transmission, and batteries into the mix, you get a complete renewable system. Tack on existing nuclear and our task gets even easier. Jordan has the most surface level, childish understanding of climate change and spouts this to millions of people.
Other issues that are coming up that I think are obfuscating our ability to evaluate what's being caused by green energy versus not. When we look at energy increases in Germany, I think there's a similar constellation around nuclear energy, for instance. People don't want nuclear energy because they think of nukes, and they think of nuclear meltdowns, and they think of Chernobyl, and they think of Fukushima, and they think of atomic bombs, and that's it. And that's stupid. And I agree with you. But nuclear energy is a totally viable alternative to other forms of fossil
Then why
fuels.
does the radical left oppose it?
I'm constantly accused of hating nuclear, and I want to clear some of these things up. First, I did my engineering capstone using a nuclear power plant. I think it's the coolest technology in the world, right up there with fusion. And that company that I worked with offered me a master's, but I ended up turning it down to go into industry. All of this doesn't change the reality that we dogfucked 40 years of nuclear development, allowing solar and wind to surpass it. That's the reality we live in, and we can't just wish it away. If you want to construct an actual pro-nuclear argument, this is what you do. First, prioritize solar, wind, hydro, batteries, and transmission for power because it always wins on economics. Second, utilize high-temperature steam electrolysis to produce pink hydrogen at a lower cost than green hydrogen. This builds out our nuclear construction capabilities while bringing down its costs. Third, don't shut down nuclear plants since long-running plants are by far our cheapest energy source, and utilize nuclear power in places with a small copper plate, like islands. Finally, as we transition, utilize natural gas as peaking plants and slowly shut them down. But no one at the Daily Wire will ever say that because their investors want blue hydrogen.
You think it's just this See, you
For the
it
same,
might
for
be
the
just-
same, for the same reason the right opposes vaccines, because it sounds scary and it's a big thing and they don't trust it. It comes
Well,
from
the
big
right
pharmaceutical-
has a reason to distrust vaccines in the aftermath of the COVID debacle.
Well, I
because
think-
they were imposed by force. But what I don't understand, for example, is why the Germans shut down their nuclear power plants and the Californians are thinking and doing the same thing when they have to import power from France anyways. Like it's complete
or
bloody-
burn coal, which is a million
they're-
times worse.
Not
Yeah.
just coal, lignite.
Yeah.
Right. And then with regards to these renewable power sources, they have a number of problems. One is they're not energy dense. They require tremendous infrastructure to produce. They might be renewable at the energy level, but they're not renewable at the raw materials level. So that's a complete bloody lie. They're insanely variable in their power production. And because of that, you have to have a backup system, and the backup system has to be reliable without variability. And that means if you have a renewable grid, you have to have a parallel fossil fuel or coal grid to back it up when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, which is unfortunately very, very frequently. And so again, and I'm not going to say there's no place for renewable energy like solar and wind, because maybe there are specific niche locales where those are useful. But the logical, antidote to the problem of reliability, if we're concerned about carbon, but we're really not, would be to use nuclear.
Isn't it more likely that people are either misinformed or misguided than people are legitimately trying to depopulate the planet?
Overall, Jordan is just a bundle of misinformation. I cut out some of the more conspiratorial parts, like the left wing wanting to depopulate the planet, if you want to go check out the original video. And to be honest, I don't think Jordan's arguments are his own. He seems to be mostly just parroting two prominent conservative climate lukewarmers, Bjorn Lomborg and Richard Lindzen. Bjorn, a guy who was convicted of academic dishonesty, but wasn't charged because he had a lack of knowledge in the field of climate science, while Richard was part of the earlier IPCC reports, but he couldn't drop his debunked cloud cover argument. This is an argument he made back in 2001, and it sure as shit hasn't come to fruition yet. If we want to talk about bad climate predictions, he's at the top of that list. Anyway, Destiny did a pretty good job. I know he wasn't expecting this conversation, but I hope this video provides the context of how misinformed Jordan is on the topic. Anyway, all the references will be linked below. Thank you.